Hey, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is for you guys. Uh, Welcome to a beginning of a year-long I don't know, you're gonna listen to me for a year long. So anyway, guys, welcome. Okay, this is our first chapter of notes for AP European history. All right, we're gonna start pretty much where your book starts in chapter one. Okay, so this chapter is called the Late Middle Ages, and we're gonna cover in this whole chapter the period from roughly about 1300, as you can see, to about 1453. Okay, so um, pause if you need to, and then we will move into our introduction or our essential question. I don't know. I'll have to figure it out. I forgot what it is. Let's see here. All right, it's in our introduction. So um, every every area of notes, every unit of notes, or every chapter, I like to begin by introducing the kinds of things that we're going to talk about in this chapter. We're not going to talk about them all in this section of the notes in 1.1, which is what we're doing today, but this is what we're going to talk about. And by the end of the chapter, we should have talked about these things, okay? All right, so what's going on in chapter one? All right, well, we're going to talk about how the late Middle Ages was this huge crisis for pretty much most of Europe, all right? There's going to be a lot of things that happen in this time period that's going to cause a lot of problems in Europe, and it's going to cause a lot of changes in Europe, and those are the things that we need to focus on. We need to focus on what is causing these problems, and we need to focus on things like what are the effects of these problems, all right? So we need to think about that as we go through the notes, all right? One of the things that we're going to talk about, and this is going to be our first topic today, is this epidemic called the bubonic plague. All right. Now, we have all lived through COVID-19 now. All right. But the COVID-19 wasn't the first epidemic that's ever swept through the world, and it wasn't the deadliest epidemic that's ever swept through the world. All right. So we're going to talk today about this thing called the bubonic plague. It's also called the Black Death, and it's going to wipe out 2/5 of Europe's population. All right. That is a huge chunk of the population just gone from the plague. All right. So that is one of the crises that we're going to talk about. Now, another crisis that we're going to talk about is this war between England and France called the Hundred Years' War. And if the bubonic plague didn't kill enough people, all right, England and France in this almost like, a world war are going to devastate not only even more people than the plague, but also land. Entire places in England and France are going to be decimated by this war. And then finally, we're going to talk about something that may not make a lot of sense right now, but when we eventually get into religion and Christianity, we're going to talk about how the church gets split between three different popes. And all three different popes are saying that they are the right pope. They are the one true pope. They are the one true messenger of God, all right? And that's going to be a problem because that's going to wreak havoc on religion. And then finally, as if all of these things weren't a crisis enough, Islamic armies from this place called the Ottoman Empire are going to start invading the eastern part of Europe. So when I say, guys, the late Middle Ages is a crisis period for Europe, I mean that it is a crisis period, all right? It is chaos. So pause if you need to, and we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so I always like to start off our notes with an essential question, all right? Now, an essential question is just what should you be focusing on as you take notes? What kinds of things should you be thinking about as we take these notes, all right? So, by the end of 1.1 today, you should be able to answer this question, okay? What were the social and economic consequences of the Black Death? We're only going to talk about the bubonic plague today, so you need to think about what are the social consequences of it and what are the economic consequences of it, okay? So write down the essential question. If you ever get lost while we're taking notes and you're wondering, what do I need to be thinking about again? That's what you need to be thinking about. Okay? So pause if you need to, and let's jump into what were the social and economic consequences of the Black Death. Okay, the bubonic plague, the Black Death. All right, I like talking about this, guys, because somewhere in our lives we have probably heard something about the bubonic plague. All right, so the very first thing I want to talk about is what caused this plague to happen in the first place. Okay, now there is a scientific answer, guys, and there's a single answer, but when we study AP history, we need to give the more complicated answers. All right, we need to talk about all of the factors. Okay, so let's talk about just basic stuff. So, European population had grown really rapidly between the years 1000 and 1300. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this growth. One of the reasons is the way that they're growing food, they use this thing called the three crop rotation system. And that, for a while, is pretty efficient at growing crops, okay? But you're going to see later on, they're going to change that and they're going to be like, that's not very efficient. But right now it is. And what happened was population increased really fast. Now, what happens when there's a lot of people? The population gets dense and people get crammed together, right? So the population, though, eventually grew so fast, right, that they outran their supply of food. So what happens when you have too many people and not enough food? You have what's called a famine, right? Okay, so famines are going to sweep through Europe. And it's not only necessarily populations, it's going to be some other factors that are going to cause these famines. But a famine is where you don't have enough food and people literally starve to death. All right, so population's growing, there's a famine. What makes things worse is in these 2 years, between 1315 and 1317, there's crop failures. Now, there's a lot of things, guys, that make crops not grow. All right. Sometimes it's climate. All right. Sometimes there's not enough rain in a year or there's a drought. Sometimes there's a disease that hits a crops, like you'll learn about later on in the 19th century, this disease that hit potatoes in Ireland and devastated Ireland. So there's all kinds of reasons for crop failures. But think about it. Bottom line is, people aren't going to have enough food. They already didn't have enough food because there was too much of a population. And now their crops are failing and there's even less food. So if you guys can imagine, even before the Black Death hits, there's this devastating idea of like famines in Europe, right? Which are going to kill people. Okay. So because there are so many people in Europe, they are densely packed together, especially in urban areas. Not so much in the rural areas, but when you get into the urban areas where the bubonic plague hits the worst, it hits the worst because people are so crammed together, right? The closer we are together, guys, the easier it is to spread disease. If I sneeze, my sneeze goes out and then you breathe it in. Or if I bump up against you and I've got the plague on me, then you now get the plague. All right? So the more densely crammed together we are, guys, the more likely we are to get a disease. Now, let's talk about another reason why the plague is going to happen. Europeans, guys, at this time, for the most part, are not very what we would call today hygienic. All right. Number one, guys, they don't bathe and wash themselves as frequently as we do today. But number two, even if they did, the water was dirty and diseased and nasty. Okay. One of the reasons is why sometimes people, when they went to the restroom, would throw it in the streets. Okay. Another reason is just going to the restroom in like an urban area, you would dig a hole in the ground, you would build a box on top of it, sit on the box, and go to the bathroom in the ground. Now, guys, I wouldn't feel like I was doing my job as a history teacher if I didn't show you a video I took at a museum that was talking about the bubonic plague in Dublin, Ireland. So I was at this museum in Ireland and they were talking about the bubonic plague and they were talking about the conditions that people lived in and they were talking about how humans went to the bathroom. And they had this exhibit, guys, and I just have to show it to you. Check it out. Oh, guys, that is so realistic. Uh, I'm not kidding though, there, guys. That exhibit was there, and my children and I just listened to that guy make those noise over and over and over. We were probably there for like I don't know, just 20 minutes, just crying. Uh, anyway, though, it's a pretty realistic depiction of how people went to the bathroom during this time period. But you can see, guys, it wasn't very hygienic. Now, It's a pretty decent idea, but the problem is this thing called the water table. You see, guys, if there's a river running through and you go to the bathroom in the ground, sometimes that human waste seeps into where the river's flowing, and all of a sudden that your drinking water becomes infected with human waste. All right? So, guys, humans, they don't bathe frequently in Europe, and their water is not very clean, and that makes things a breeding ground for not only disease, but a breeding ground for rats. And that is the key that we're looking for here. What really caused the Black Death, guys? Well, rats from trading ships in the Black Sea, all right, are going to carry this plague to Europe. Trading ships, right? Okay. So, excuse me. These rats are on the ships. The rats have the plague in them. And what happens is, guys, because humans in Europe are so dirty, guess what happens? They're covered in fleas. Well, guys, a flea bites a rat. It gets the disease in it. Then that same flea goes and bites a human, and they now get the bubonic plague. All right? So rats carry the disease. Fleas jumping from rats to dirty humans transmitted the disease. So, guys, those are the causes of the plague. So, even before the plague hits, you guys see Europeans are in a pretty desperate situation. They're malnourished, they're not getting enough nutrition, guys, and that just makes the plague even worse. All right? So, pause if you need to. All right, now, this is always fun to talk about remedies for the plague. What did they think would cure the plague? Well, guys, one of the things that you're going to learn about in this class is that not only Europeans, guys, but humans in the past have some pretty funny ideas about medicine. They had no idea of the medicine that we have today, guys. They didn't have understanding of what a disease was, all right? What causes a lot of diseases. So let's talk about what are some ways that people thought to cure the plague, okay? All right, guys. So, you guys have probably seen this, a plague doctor. We'll talk about that guy in a second, all right? But medieval scholars thought that disease happened because our bodies had what they called the four humors. But when they looked at a body, they saw four different kinds of liquid coming out of a body, and, they called it bile, they called it blood, water. But anyway, bottom line is, when these four fluids in the body got out of balance, they thought, oh, that's what caused the disease. Their fluids are out of balance, or their what they called humors were out of balance, all right? And one of the things that they thought was eating different colored plants for specific reasons would cure diseases. So let me give you an example. Have you guys ever heard of jaundice? All right. Jaundice is something that sometimes infants get where they're born. And it's oh, come on. I forget what vitamin is. It's maybe vitamin D or vitamin C. Anyway, I think it's D, deficiency. And one of the things that you do is you put the baby in the sunlight and they get a lot of vitamin D, and their jaundice goes away. All right. And if you don't know, jaundice makes your skin kind of turn yellow. All right. So think about it. This is what they thought. Oh, that guy has yellow skin. If they eat a yellow plant, then that plant will cure that skin disease that is making them yellow, jaundice. All right. So that's kind of what they thought. Oh, this person has this rash. We'll eat this color plant that is kind of red, and that will cure their rash. Now, what's interesting is accidentally they actually did apply some effective remedies because people were eating plants, and a lot of plants have natural things in them that can heal the body. All right. Now, it doesn't heal the plague, but that's kind of what they thought about curing diseases. All right. Now, scholars also thought that bad air, just this random idea of bad air caused the plague. All right. They thought that when earthquakes happened, smoke and fumes come out of the ground, and when you breathe that in, you get disease. So, how do you fight that? Well, a lot of the things that they would do was they would go into a house where there was a plague, and they would put sweet smelling aromatic flowers. All right. They would burn things and create smoke in the room, and they would call it fumigate, but they would smoke out the room to try to get the bad air out. And you know what? Smoking kind of was effective because smoking killed the fleas. Now, they didn't know they were killing the fleas. They didn't even know that fleas were causing the plague. All right. But they thought that smoke would get out the bad air that caused the plague. Which, look at the plague doctor right here. Why does the plague doctor look like he does? Well, he's got his whole body covered in this kind of robe, right? Because he doesn't want to touch the skin of somebody with the plague. He's got this mask on, and you see that beak? That beak would be stuffed with different kinds of good smelling flowers and things like that. Why? Because you thought that would kind of get rid of the bad air. All right, so that's why plague doctors look creepy like the way they do. That beak is stuffed with different kinds of herbs and flowers and good smelling things. All right. Now, another thing they did was social distancing. Okay. They thought at the end of the day, the best way to not get the plague is to move away from anybody that has the plague, right? Social distancing and cover your face like the plague doctor here, right? Don't breathe in the same air as these guys. Okay. Now, there were also a lot of scholars, and we're going to talk about it today, guys, because people didn't look at science the way we look at science today. All right, they thought that the plague was actually God's punishment on Europeans. All right, so why do we have this plague? Well, God is punishing us. Okay, that was what was causing the plague. So you can see, guys, there's a lot of different reasons why people think the plague's happening. But think about this, though. You think God is punishing society. Now, this is really kind of funny and really kind of sad at the same time. There were these priests in different places in Europe, and they were called flagellants. All right. And what they would do is they were these kind of radical people, and they would go out into the streets and they would take these whips. All right. And they would whip their bodies bloody to show God how sorry they were. And they thought if they went out and beat themselves and whipped themselves enough, that God would see how sorry everybody was. And he would be like, all right, guys, you've beaten yourself enough. I'll pull the plague away. Right? So you guys can kind of see, right? This is kind of crazy, the kinds of things that they thought would actually cure the plague. All right. Now, one other thing, guys, and a very bad side effect of the bubonic plague was the persecution of Jews. Now, one of the things that's going to be a consistent theme throughout European history that we will talk about all the way to the end of the year is going to be persecution of Jewish people. And we're going to talk about a lot of different reasons why. All right. But anyway, Jews were often blamed by Christians. Most of Europe is Christian, but there are Jewish people that live there. And we'll learn later on. There are some Muslim people that live there too. But European Christians often blamed Jews when bad things happen. All right. So widespread persecution and massacres of Jews occurred because if you're a Christian, you were like, oh, it's got to be the Jews. All right. So there were these things called pogroms where there were these Jewish massacres that occurred all over Europe. All right. So pretty crazy what people do when a plague or an epidemic happens, right? And we know how crazy people got in COVID-19. So it's not so hard to believe we lived through kind of a little bit of that, right? All right, so pause if you need to. All right, now, before we talk about, guys, the effects of the plague, we need to talk about this concept called feudalism. All right, so feudalism was basically the system that Europeans lived under. Okay, so let me explain it. So, the people at the top, the kings, all right, wealthy noble lords that own land. Clergy means church officials like bishops. These are all the people at the top of society, all right? And they rule or control different lands because they are able to own land. The only people that could own land in medieval Europe were wealthy nobles and clergy. You had to be noble to own land. Now, later on, people will be able to buy land, all right, like wealthy merchants. And later on, peasants will even be able to own land. But early on, it was pretty much the kings and the nobility that were able and allowed to own land, all right? So they owned land and they ruled the land that they owned. Now, underneath them, every king or lord or church person has to have an army that fights for them, right? So knights provided kings and lords military support, and they also paid taxes to the king. And the king would take that tax money and do something better with the country or build a huge palace. All right. Now, underneath the knights were another level, kind of a middle class. They were merchants and skilled craftsmen, and their job it was to make manufactured goods, right? So you might have a cobbler, a shoemaker, you might have a tailor, a clothing maker, or a blacksmith, and their job was to make manufactured goods that people bought. And they too paid taxes to the lord and kings. Now, at the very bottom of society, you had peasants. And what was the peasant's job? To work the land, right? To grow the crops for everybody to eat. Peasants had to give a certain portion of crops to their wealthy landowner, and they had to pay taxes, but they also had to pay tithes. If you've ever been to church and put the little money in the tray, that's a tithe, right? So peasants paid taxes, all right, to the people above them. Merchants paid taxes to the people above them, right? And it all goes up. Everybody has a role in society, right? Everybody's got a purpose. That's what feudalism is. Pause if you need to. All right, now let's talk about, guys, the consequences of the plague. All right, that was our essential question, right? Okay, so big consequence. Entire villages of human beings completely wiped out. All right. I mean, just gone. Men, women, children killed by the plague. All right. But think about this. Peasant farmers are going to die. And if there's less peasants to grow the crops, that means there's going to be less food, right? But think about this too. If there's less peasants, then the peasants that survive are going to be able to say, hey, nobles, you need my labor. My labor is now more valuable. So a lot of peasants are going to start kind of rising up and demanding better wages, better conditions, better laws that include them. Uh-oh, do you see a little bit of rise in power here from the people at the bottom? Why? Because they can demand it, because they are providing a necessary service, right? Some peasants are going to move to the cities, all right, to find work as a skilled labor, right? Some peasants are going to be like, I'm not going to grow food anymore. I'm going to go join a guild. We'll talk about what that is later. I'm going to learn how to be a blacksmith, or I'm going to learn how to be a baker, or I'm going to learn how to be a tailor, a clothing maker, right? So some peasants are going to move and learn a different skill. Now, nobles are going to lose power, all right, because they are forced to pay more money for workers, right? They are forced to give more rights to people because there's not enough workers to go around, and the workers are demanding, hey, we're not going to work unless you give us better rights, unless you give us more money. So the nobility is going to lose power in Europe. Now, some lords are going to get a little crazy, and they're going to get this idea of, well, it's my land. I make the law. What if I pass a law that says peasants can't move off my land? And I control them and I kind of keep them, not quite like a slave, but almost like a slave. So some lords are going to pass laws that prevent their peasants from moving off their land. And some lords are also going to pass laws that say, hey, from here on in, I'm going to pass a law that says I don't have to pay any wages higher than this. Now think about this, guys. If the nobles start passing these kind of laws, how do you think the peasants are going to feel about that? The peasants are going to be like, oh, heck no, you can't do that, right? So anyway, that's going to cause a big fight all over Europe, several big fights, okay? Pause if you need to. All right, so England actually does that. All right. English Parliament passes this thing called the Statute of Laborers around 1381. Basically, they forbade peasants in England to move. They said, look, you can't move off your lord's land. You got to stay there. Also, we are going to pay you the same wages that we paid before the plague. So what did peasants do? Guys, all over England, they rose up in a revolt, and there was a big fight. A lot of people died, guys, and it caused havoc all over England. Why? Because the peasants are like, no, we have power now, right? You need us. Big fight, right? So peasants revolted. It caused chaos throughout England. It also happened in France. There was a similar revolt called the Jacquerie. Same thing happened, right? Peasants were angry because the nobles were trying to lock them down, right? Now, wealthy merchants grew in power because now land-owning nobles are losing power. These wealthy merchants that didn't have a lot of rights are going to start gaining more rights. Plus, guys, kings are going to begin to exploit division among the nobles and the merchants and centralize their own power or make themselves more powerful. So there's a lot of consequences that come from the bubonic plague. All right? We're going to stop our notes right there, guys. I'll see you in class.